You know, in putting this thing together, having not done anything quite like this before as it relates to just a day of education, there's a lot of work that goes into getting this thing planned and making sure that it goes off smoothly. And, you know, when you do something like this and it's the first time, you know, the fear you walk around with every day is anybody going to show up? You know, and so we're obviously very happy to see everybody here, and more importantly, I'm thrilled with the work and the effort that our staff put in putting this thing together. And Crystal kind of headed this up. Crystal's my assistant, and she's really just gone above and beyond in putting this whole thing together. And she's got a team of people behind her that helped her with getting all this stuff organized, from the little banners to getting all the PowerPoint presentations put together and getting the speakers arranged. And so I just want to say thank you to everybody for all the work that you did. I really appreciate it, and the day's been a great hit so far. So our next speaker is Dr. Walter Cook, and he is at the Texas A&M Veterinary College as well, veterinary school. And I've had the privilege of getting to know him a little bit. And as it was said earlier, we had tried to do this before COVID, and unfortunately COVID delayed a lot of things. But now that we're here, it's a great pleasure to have him come and talk. And for landowners all over the state, you know, we've heard about these outbreaks of anthrax. And here a couple of years ago, there was a really significant outbreak that affected a lot of landowners, and there were a lot of animals that died. And I know some landowners kind of out towards Uvalde and that area over there that were particularly impacted in a really significant way. So I don't know a whole lot about anthrax, and so I'm really anxious to hear what he's going to share with us today and what tools he might be able to give us as it relates to land management for dealing with a potential future outbreak. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Walter Cook.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thanks everybody for being here. And Crystal, thank you for helping getting me kind of lined up here and straightened out. Just to give you a little bit of my background, I grew up in a rural part of California, calf country, row crops. I went to Cal Poly as an undergrad and then to UC Davis for vet school, and about that time I was really sick of California and realized I needed to get out of there. And so then I went to Wyoming, did a PhD there, planning on just doing a PhD, but I ended up staying around for about 23 years total. And the big disease that we have up in Wyoming, the big wildlife disease, is brucellosis. That's the one that the elk and bison get, and it gets transferred to cattle and causes a lot of controversy. Well, there is quite a few really top-notch brucellosis researchers at Texas A&M, and I wasn't really a researcher primarily. I was primarily a wildlife and livestock manager, disease manager. But I got to know those folks at A&M quite well. And when Don Davis decided to retire, he tried to recruit me to come to Texas A&M, and I really enjoyed Wyoming, but it is kind of cold and windy up there. So I told my wife, I said, Don's retiring and he thinks I should apply for his job. And she said, hell yes, you're gonna apply. I'm sick and tired of these winters. And so that's what brought me to Texas A&M, and I haven't looked back, and I've really enjoyed my time at A&M. Do a lot of teaching, do some research that I'll talk about, and do some service work as well. So today I'm going to talk about anthrax, a disease that I've already talked to several of you here in the audience that have had some negative impacts due to this disease. It's a bacterial disease caused by Bacillus anthracis. It is worldwide in distribution, so it's not just an important disease for Texas, but also for many, many countries, including many of the countries where your exotic wildlife come from, Africa and Asia and some others. So the stuff that I'm going to talk about is certainly relevant to Texas, but like Dr. Durr was saying with the genetics, the implications go well beyond Texas. And so with some of the things we're looking at doing certainly could help out some of the real catastrophes that they have in other countries. In fact, a couple of years ago, well, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, we were doing a tour of Kruger National Park in South Africa, and the guide there told us that they had lost all of their sable due to anthrax. So pretty significant. I think a lot of you realize that here in Texas, well, around the world, alkaline soils where the spores of the anthrax seem to do really well. And we get these cycles where we'll have a wet spring and then a hot, dry summer, and that seems to precipitate an outbreak in a lot of cases. Virtually all mammals are considered to be susceptible to anthrax, but we tend to see the biggest death loss in our herbivores. And we'll talk about that some more here. There are quite a few bacteria that will create spores as a way to be resistant when they're not in their host, but anthrax is the king of resistant spores. That spore of anthrax can survive in the soil. It's been documented surviving in the soil for over 100 years. There's no other bacteria that can do that. So it's very resistant, particularly in those correct alkaline soils. When the host picks up those spores, the spore changes to the vegetative or the reproductive form of the bacteria, and that's the form that causes disease. It causes disease by producing very powerful toxins, and it's those toxins that actually ultimately will kill the animal. And then that animal dies when that carcass opens up either naturally or because of a predator or because of an unknowing human might open that carcass. Those vegetative cells revert to the spore form, and then we've got that very resistant form again that can contaminate the environment and set the stage for additional animals to get infected. The livestock world is very familiar with anthrax, at least in the areas that see a lot of anthrax. And so they will vaccinate their animals against anthrax every year. There is this Stern strain vaccine that's been around for 90 years now, and it's very effective. Unfortunately, the immunity is rather short-lived, so that's why they have to vaccinate every year. But they know how to do that and how to handle that. If you catch an animal or a human that has anthrax early on, early enough in the course of the disease, there are some antibiotics, tetracyclines, penicillins that are quite effective, but again, it has to be treated very early in the course of the disease because anthrax kills really rapidly. And we'll show some pictures. The best management technique when an animal does die of anthrax is to burn or bury the carcasses. So there are different manifestations of anthrax, and those appear depending on the route of infection. Cutaneous is the skin. This is the most common for humans, particularly humans that might be handling carcasses. You got a little cut on your skin, and the anthrax spores get into that cut, and you're going to get the cutaneous form. Fairly common. It causes a really dark black kind of canker-type sore. Fortunately, that is not a particularly lethal form of anthrax. The gastrointestinal, that's an animal that basically eats the spores. It gets into the digestive system and then reproduces there. So that's what we particularly see in our herbivores and most of our livestock species and our wild and exotic species as well. And that's pretty darn lethal. But the most lethal is inhalation, the respiratory form. That's what weaponized anthrax is looking at. They're trying to use anthrax as a weapon against either soldiers or as a bioterrorism agent to get people to inhale it, and then it sets up a pneumonia in the lungs that's extremely lethal. Fortunately, naturally, that's not a very common route. So again, these animals can die very suddenly. In fact, I've had quite a few people that have told me they've literally watched an animal that looks like it was walking along normally and then it just suddenly keeled over. I'm not entirely sure I believe it was that rapid, but anthrax can kill animals very, very rapidly to where they have very few signs. So you might see an animal staggering around a little bit, labored breathing, trembling, and then just collapse, maybe have some convulsions and die. Other animals might take a couple of days to die, and in this case, you might, if it's a livestock species anyways, you might take a temperature and find that they've got a very high fever, They're depressed, stupor, breathing and heart problems, again, staggering convulsions. They stop ruminating. Some of them will abort their fetus shortly before they die. And you'll notice bloody discharges and again, death. When you see those kind of signs in an animal with anthrax, they're not going to make it. So again, this is too late in the course to try to treat these animals. This is what we see in our cycle of anthrax. And so this is just, again, reiterating the fact that humans can get infected. So we get our animals that are infected, and this has happened actually in Minnesota. There was a cow that died, and the owners of that cow decided, well, this animal just died, we should not let the meat go to waste, and so they ate it. Well, they ended up getting intestinal anthrax from that. Fortunately, they were diagnosed pretty early, and so they were successfully treated, but a very scary situation for sure. So again, under normal situations, these animals would die, and the carcass would get opened, and the vegetative forms would form and become exposed to oxygen and become the spores that are highly resistant that other animals could then ingest. The other thing is biting, not just biting flies, but other carcass flies, blowflies can be involved in the cycle. So that's one of the ways you can see animals getting cutaneous anthrax is if they get bitten by a fly that's carrying the spores. That fly can start a localized infection in the skin. That could happen to people as well. So this is a white-tailed deer that died of anthrax, and I want you to notice an extreme number of flies. These are blowflies on this animal. So we talked about the biting flies and what they can do, but these blowflies, what flies like to do is they eat and they overindulge, and then they go land someplace, and a lot of times they'll kind of vomit up. I'm sorry to be talking about this right after lunch, but some of that contents that they ate. And so, these flies here, you can see the surrounding vegetation. They can vomit up on there, and now that vegetation has spores in it. So that's one of the ways we can see both grazers being affected, as we've talked about earlier today, grazers that might be eating the grass because the spores are in the soil. They pick it up that way. But then when that animal dies, that carcass, those flies can then spread it to the browse that's surrounding. And so then you can start to see browsers getting affected by anthrax as well. Just a pile of animals that died on a ranch that we went and visited a couple of years ago due to anthrax. So the outbreaks, the numbers can be absolutely astounding. So how do we try to manage, like I told about livestock producers in the areas that have anthrax, they're accustomed to dealing with this by vaccination. But in wildlife, that's really not a very easy thing to do, at least not with the current techniques. Trying to treat in the face of an outbreak is virtually impossible. One of the things with vaccination, you need to vaccinate those animals well before the outbreak begins because those animals needed some time to develop some immunity to the anthrax. And anthrax requires two vaccinations 2 to 3 weeks apart. And you want to have that second vaccination at least 2 or 3 weeks before the outbreak starts. So that's why it's pretty much a recipe for disaster if you're going to wait until an outbreak to start vaccinating your animals. It's going to be too late. Certainly carcass control is really important to minimize further losses of animals, but it's also really important in terms of human health and trying to minimize human exposure and how you handle those carcasses, being very careful that you don't expose yourself to anthrax and cause human disease. So we certainly recommend that you wear gloves, protective clothing, that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, when does anthrax tend to happen in Texas? In the very hot weather, and so wearing a lot of clothing, coveralls and stuff like that. Most people don't want to do that when it's that hot, but it can really be important. So this is the preferred method so you can see here, we've got a carcass under here with some tires, and we're setting it on fire, because that's the only way you're going to destroy the spores. Practically speaking, that or basically formaldehyde. So if you burn the carcass, you're going to destroy the spores. You're going to eliminate that as a source of further infection. What's the problem with burns in late summer in Texas? Yeah, I mean, you can appreciate, look at this vegetation around here. This guy's at pretty big risk of starting a pretty hellacious wildfire. And a lot of counties are going to have fire bans in effect during the time of year that we're going to see outbreaks. So while this is the best technique to use in terms of getting rid of the spores of anthrax, it's not a very practical technique for most of the time that we see anthrax outbreaks in Texas. So because of that, what we're recommending is deep burial. Burying those carcasses, don't open them up, don't cut them open, and just bury them in a deep graves, if you will, so that hopefully you get that carcass down low enough to where those spores won't come up to the surface. Well, what about vaccinating wildlife? And we've had some people that have looked at this. Obviously, rounding up wildlife and running them through a chute and hand vaccinating them, it may be possible with some of the captive deer operations, but not very practical for almost anybody else. Well, what about vaccinating animals with a dart? We have shown, at least with white-tailed deer, that you can produce just as good a response by vaccinating those animals with a dart as you can by hand vaccinating them. Again, if you got hundreds of animals to vaccinate, that's an extremely labor-intensive process. And again, you need to do it twice, 2 to 3 weeks apart. Not practical under most conditions. However, for certain people that might have a couple of individual really valuable animals, some individual exotics, that is a technique that can be used. But again, you got to do it early enough before that outbreak happens to have that immune response in effect before the anthrax outbreak occurs. So practically speaking, the only real way to prevent anthrax outbreaks in wild and exotic animals is an oral vaccination, which sounds great, but I'm going to tell you that oral vaccinations are much more complicated. There is an oral vaccine program for rabies, for coyotes and raccoons. That's been pretty effective. Rabies is a virus, and for reasons I won't go into, it's a lot easier to create a vaccine, and particularly an oral vaccine against a virus, than it is to create such a vaccine against a bacteria, which is what anthrax is. But we've started down this road, and we're trying to see if we can get this to work. So we started off, well, I guess it's about 6 or 7 years ago, about 6 years ago. My graduate student, now Dr. Ben, did her PhD looking at an oral vaccine in mice. This project still cost $120,000, but it was a lot cheaper doing it in mice than if we'd have done it in larger species. That's why we chose to do it in mice initially. So what she did is she took the regular Stern strain, the vaccine that's commercially available, and microencapsulated it. And that's what this is showing here, is showing some of these micro capsules. So the concept of a microcapsule is, imagine gumball machines. We've all seen gumball machines. We've got this big bubble, and then inside that bubble is all the gumballs that are in there. So that bubble of the gumball machine is like the capsule, and then the gumballs themselves are the spores of the vaccine. So that's kind of the concept, but then it's at a microscopic level. So very small little capsules like that. And that capsule is designed, and we're using techniques that were developed by Dr. Allison Rice Ficht at Texas A&M. She developed this technique for brucellosis vaccine, because they've been trying to develop oral vaccines for brucellosis for use in wildlife. And that, again, that's kind of how I got to know some of this work from Wyoming. And again, I mean, 20 years and people were not being able to find a successful brucellosis vaccine doing it orally, but when she microencapsulated it, was able to get it to work. So we thought we would use this same process for the anthrax vaccine. Well, it turned out to be a lot more complicated because of the sporulation and the vegetative cells that anthrax have. Brucellosis doesn't have that. And so you want to keep it in the spore form and not the vegetative form, and it turned out to be a lot more technologically challenging than we anticipated. So it took a lot more time. We finally got a technique figured out how to do this, One of the things that we found was, because some people have tried doing this, they've taken the Stern strain vaccine, put out some feed baits, and just dumped that vaccine on the feed thinking, hey, we're going to vaccinate our animals. Well, when we did it in mice, there was no response. It was just like we'd poured salt water on the feed. They didn't respond at all. But when we encapsulated the vaccine, we got a response in the mice. This was just looking at an immune response. We didn't actually challenge them against anthrax because that gets quite expensive. But we got immune responses in the mice from using that technique. Well, how many of you guys are breeding mice? Nope, there's not much of a mouse industry for the exotic, no. So we realized we got to do something, we got to prove that this actually works in ruminants for a couple of reasons. One is because we want to show, but also mouse have a digestive system more or less like a human's. It's a simple digestive system. Ruminants, most of your hoofed animals, have a much more complicated digestive system. So we needed to validate this in ruminants. So we started off with white-tailed deer, Chase Nunez, and this is Chase here. And he's actually former student of mine, Jack Richardson, is holding this deer and he's orally vaccinating this deer using this same vaccine. We've done this project in white-tailed deer. We actually did 3 different projects and we're still evaluating the results, but our initial data looks pretty promising. It's looking like we're getting a response that we want. And we just this week have started a project with axis deer doing the same thing. So we're doing a couple of things we did with the whitetail. We needed to have a positive control. So that was an animal that just got the subcutaneous vaccine like you would normally give to livestock. Well, I also mentioned that we validated darting as a delivery mechanism. So that was part of this study as well. And then the oral vaccine portion of it. So now we're trying that in axis deer, just started that this week. And we'll see how those results go. So why is this relevant? Why is this important? Well, a lot of you in this room are quite aware of why it's important. We've had some pretty serious anthrax problems the last few years. One of the things that we have found is anthrax tends to be cyclical. We'll have a bad outbreak 1 year and then you'll go 5 or 7 years before you have another bad outbreak, at least in a given area. And in that interim, people tend to forget about it. So right after you've had an outbreak, people get really motivated and they try to do all these vaccination techniques and doing different things to try to control it, but then they kind of forget about it. And their animals are not protected, and then there's another big outbreak. 2019 was one of the worst outbreaks that we've had in a long time in the state of Texas. Confirmed 20 premises in 5 different counties. Well, as we'll talk about, the difference between the number of animals that are confirmed versus the number of animals that are actually dying from anthrax are 2 different things. So you can see a variety of different species were affected, including some wild and exotic species. These counties that are involved, these are the historic, if you will, endemic area. So an endemic area means an area that you expect to see anthrax on a fairly regular basis. And indeed, these counties, these 5 counties here, will have some level of anthrax virtually every year. But then in certain years, like 2019, you'll have a really bad outbreak. And interestingly enough, Edwards and Maverick counties, which are considered endemic, did not seem to be affected. At least there were no reports that there was any cases in those counties. So this triangle here is representing what we call the historic endemic area of Texas, okay? From Eagle Pass to Uvalde to Ozona. That triangle is, again, the endemic area that we can see anthrax virtually every year. And again, in 2019, our outbreak was pretty much confined to that same area, with a couple of counties not being affected, at least as far as we know. So although it was a really horrible outbreak and a lot of animals died, it wasn't unexpected, at least in geographically, not unexpected. 2020 and 2021 are a different situation. had some really unexpected occurrences. Outbreaks in the Panhandle. Panhandle of Texas hasn't seen anthrax, and at least hasn't reported anthrax in 50 years. And now we're starting to see some cases. Fairly localized, but those ranches that were affected very heavily. And one of the problems, this was cattle ranches. These are ranches that could have vaccinated their animals, but they didn't. Why? Because they're not in the endemic anthrax area. If you haven't seen anthrax for 50 years, are you going to vaccinate against it? Why would you? Well, when they start having animals die, what can they do? It's kind of too late, really, to try to vaccinate those animals. The cattle, deer, and horses were affected. Interestingly enough, at least one of the ranches had quite a few aoudad, and at least they didn't see any aoudad that died from it. So this is what we're talking about here in the more recent cases. So again, our historic endemic area, well, in 2020, we did have cases in these counties that we would normally expect. Not the kind of outbreak that we did in 2019, but still had some. But in 2020, here in Armstrong and Briscoe County, thanks, I couldn't quite read that from here, up in the Panhandle, we got some cases there. And again, some of those ranches were really heavily impacted. And here's showing 2021. Again, same thing. So we've got some cases in the historic endemic area, but Hardeman and Armstrong counties, Hardeman on the Oklahoma border, they hadn't had anthrax in a long, long time, and now we've got some additional cases in Armstrong. So we actually had some cattle producers that were calling us saying, hey, can we use your oral vaccine to try to vaccinate our cattle? Well, our oral vaccine is not to that stage yet. So those are the cases that we know about. One of the problems that we have with almost any regulatory disease is what we call suppressed reporting. People that recognize that they may have a disease and they don't report it. They don't want the government to know that they've got this disease on their place. That is particularly a problem with anthrax in the state of Texas. Because if you own a piece of property and you diagnose anthrax on that property, when you go to sell it, you've got to notify the buyer that you've had anthrax on that place. So there is an incentive for people not to diagnose anthrax on their place. That is a real problem. It's a problem for the regulatory agencies to know how big the outbreak is. It's also a real problem for me as a researcher. Because when I go to USDA and I say I need funding to develop an oral anthrax vaccine, they say, well, how many cases do you have of anthrax? Well, we get on average 12 to 16 cases reported a year. They say, well, this disease is not worth putting money towards. There's not enough animals dying. Well, we know that the numbers are much, much, much higher than that. In 2019, I think we had a little over 100 confirmed cases, but the estimates are about 10,000 wild and exotic animals died. But that's just an estimate. I can't use that in documentation to try to get funding. So that is one of the limitations for us with regards to anthrax. So one of the things that we're wanting to do is to see if we can document anthrax exposure a little bit more definitively. The hypothesis is that animals get exposed to anthrax and they die. Well, we're starting to see some evidence that not all animals always die, that some animals may survive. It's probably because they got exposed to a very low dose, not enough to kill those animals, or maybe the route. If they got a cutaneous exposure, they may survive that as opposed to if they had a gastrointestinal exposure. So we have some evidence that some animals can survive from anthrax. And so we are wanting to document what is the prevalence of antibodies in our wild and exotic animals in these areas that we're concerned about as a way to document levels of exposure. So we are interested in getting blood samples. We're doing this during this hunting season from white-tailed deer and feral pigs. Feral pigs are kind of interesting because they certainly root around in the soil. So they should get exposed to a lot of spores, but they seem to be relatively resistant. They will certainly die if they get exposed to it enough, but we don't see large numbers of feral pigs dying of anthrax typically. So our thought is if we can get some blood samples from white-tailed deer and some feral pigs, we might be able to document the level of exposure that's out there. So if any of you landowners are in any of these areas that have had anthrax in the last couple of years, if you've got some hunters that are going out harvesting animals, we would be very interested in getting a blood tube from them so we can test them for antibodies to anthrax. We will not report that. First of all, it's not a confirmed diagnosis, so that's not a reportable diagnosis when you just detect antibodies. But we're also not going to put any publications on exact locations. We're just going to report by the counties where we might have seen anthrax. And again, my graduate student, Chase Nunez, is doing that. If you're interested, there's his phone number. Please give him a call. He'll get you some blood tubes so you can collect those samples for us. Just want to give a nod to the people that have helped fund this work to date. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, they have provided some funding for this oral anthrax vaccine research. Exotic Wildlife Association, the Second Arc Foundation has as well. In addition to a private contributor, I didn't even know this person. They just sent us a check one day, and I'm pretty happy to get that. That was kind of cool. So certainly appreciate that. And certainly appreciate the places that have let us do some of this anthrax work. The Winnie Carter Wildlife Center is a wildlife center on the Texas A&M campus. It has a small number of white-tailed deer. That was our initial project. Flying Bee Ranch, Dr. Scott Bugaj, if you know him, he let us do a fairly large vaccine trial on his whitetails. Texas A&M Kingsville did as well. And now the Diamond R Ranch, Robert Yates is where we're doing this axis deer research. And I'm really happy to see these private ranches stepping up and allowing this kind of research to go on, because I think that's showing that people are taking the long-term view of this, recognizing that this may not help me with my ranch this year or next year, but maybe 5 or 10 years from now, maybe even when I'm out of the business, if we have an oral vaccine in 10 or 15 years, it'll help the next generation. So I'm very thankful and enthused by that. And that's basically the extent of my presentation. I see there's a question in the back. Do I have time to take a few questions? Yep. The people where we did the research? Okay, so I'll give you a little more detail. We're at this stage of the research, we're looking at immune responses. When we vaccinate these animals, do they develop an immune response? Frankly, obviously we're getting our hands on these animals. If you are in the endemic zone and you get your hands on the animal at this point in time, you're best off giving a subcutaneous vaccine. But it also has to be at the right time of year. So some of this work, like the axis deer we're doing right now, well, even if this vaccine works just as good as a hand injection, they're probably not going to have any immunity left by next summer by the time it rolls around. So we're just looking at, do they produce an immune response from the oral vaccine that's comparable to what they would get from the injected response. So yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, ma'am. How do we choose the ranches? What criteria did we use? Mostly it was based on people that were cooperative with us, because it's not just as simple as we just give them a vaccine. We have to give them the vaccine twice, so you got to handle them twice to give them the vaccine, and then every 2 to 4 weeks we're sampling those animals again to look for immune responses to see if they develop an immune response, and then how long does it happen. So obviously every time you work animals, you're putting stress on them. You have in some of these cases, we're having to dart the animals, knock them down. So you have potential for losing animals every time you do that. So it has to be somebody that kind of goes into it with eyes wide open. So again, these people are taking the long view. I mean, in many of these cases, these guys lost some of their animals due to the vaccine work that we're doing. Not due to the vaccine, but due to the repeated handling that we're doing. So if they're willing to kind of take that risk, then that's kind of how we work with them. And certainly we'd be interested in potentially partnering with some other folks as well. So, any other questions? All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walter Cook.